There was a candy that came in a bright orange bag, and the moment you poured a handful into your palm, you already knew exactly what was coming. Not soft, not chewy, a thin shell of milk chocolate that cracked clean, and underneath it, that unmistakable crunch. Crispy, layered peanut butter all the way through. One bite was never enough. At its peak in the mid-1990s, Butterfinger BBs were everywhere a kid could reach. They were in the Halloween bag, rattling around in the orange and black fun-size box. They were at the movie theater concession stand, sold in a carton you tipped straight into your mouth in the dark. They were on the checkout shelf at every Kroger, every Safeway, every Winn-Dixie from Maine to California. Right next to the register, right at eye level, right where you grab them without thinking twice. Bart Simpson told you nobody better lay a finger on them. And for a decade, that felt true. Then somewhere around 2006, the shelf was empty. No announcement, no farewell, no last bag to hold on to. Just gone. How does a candy that an entire generation grew up eating simply vanish while the bar it came from is still sitting on that same shelf today? This is that story. To understand where Butterfinger BBs came from, you have to go back to a corporate conference room in the early 1990s and to a company that had just spent a lot of money buying a brand it was determined to make bigger. Nestle acquired the Butterfinger name in 1990 as part of a larger deal that handed the Swiss food giant a portfolio of classic American candy brands, including Baby Ruth and Bit-O-Honey. The acquisition cost Nestle roughly $2.5 billion, one of the largest candy deals in American history at that point. And the moment the ink dried, the pressure began. Nestle had not paid that price to simply maintain what already existed. They needed growth. They needed new products. They needed Butterfinger to be more than a single candy bar sitting in a wrapper on a peg hook. The original Butterfinger bar had been around since 1923. It was invented by the Curtis Candy Company in Chicago, the same company behind Baby Ruth, and it had survived decades of ownership changes, reformulations, and shifting American tastes on the strength of one thing nobody had ever successfully copied: that filling. Layers of crispy, flaked peanut butter candy built up like pastry coated in chocolate. Not smooth peanut butter, not the soft center you got in a Reese's cup. Something that shattered when you bit into it, something that stuck to your back teeth in the best possible way. The Curtis slogan had called it crispity, crunchity, peanut buttery. And that phrase, as corny as it sounds today, was a precise technical description of what made the bar unlike anything else in the candy aisle. By 1990, that bar was already a proven commodity, but it was a single format, one size, one shape, one occasion. You bought it, you unwrapped it, you ate it alone. Nestlé's product team looked at what was happening in the broader candy market and saw an obvious gap. Reese's Pieces had been on shelves since 1978, and after their starring role alongside E.T. in 1982, they had become a permanent fixture in American candy culture. Small, poppable, shareable, the kind of candy you poured into a bowl at a party or passed around a movie theater row. M&M's had owned that format for decades, and both of them were built around peanut butter and chocolate. The same core flavor combination that Butterfinger had always claimed as its own territory. The question someone asked in that product development meeting, and it was the right question, was simple. Why did Butterfinger only exist in one form? The bar was beloved. The flavor was distinctive. But you couldn't share it easily. You couldn't pour it. You couldn't tip it into your mouth from a carton in the dark of a movie theater. You had to unwrap it, break it, hand pieces to someone, and the filling crumbled everywhere the moment you tried. What if that filling came in a small, round, self-contained piece, coated in chocolate, bite-sized, ready to pour? The engineering challenge was real. The crunch of a Butterfinger bar comes from a specific manufacturing process. The peanut butter mixture is pulled and layered until it creates that distinctive flake texture, almost like a very dense honeycomb. Reproducing that structure inside a small sphere, one no bigger than a large marble, required the production team to essentially miniaturize a process that had been designed for a 2-inch wide candy bar. The chocolate shell had to be thin enough that it cracked immediately on contact, thick enough to protect the filling during shipping and shelf life. The whole piece had to hold together through a bag toss across the room, but surrender instantly to a single bite. They got it right. When the first production runs came off the line, the piece delivered exactly what the concept promised. The chocolate cracked, the filling crunched. It tasted like a Butterfinger, compressed, concentrated, in a form you could eat 6 of in 30 seconds without thinking about it. They called it BBs, small, round, and the name had the right feel. Quick, percussive, a little dangerous sounding, like something you'd fire from a toy gun, which was exactly the kind of thing a 10-year-old in 1992 would find appealing. And there was already a plan in place for exactly how to reach that 10-year-old. Nestle had been building a relationship with a television show that, by 1992, had become the most talked about program in American households. A show about a cartoon family in a fictional American town. A show whose oldest son had already appeared in Butterfinger bar advertising, telling the world in that flat, unimpressed voice of his that nobody better lay a finger on his Butterfinger. The partnership between Butterfinger and The Simpsons had begun in 1988, before the show even had its own time slot, when the characters were still appearing as bumpers on The Tracy Ullman Show. Nestle saw something in that connection early. Bart Simpson was not a wholesome spokesperson. He was a kid who didn't follow rules, didn't share his candy, and didn't apologize for either. That was, it turned out, exactly the right personality to sell a candy that was meant to be hoarded, grabbed, and eaten fast before anyone else could get to it. By the time BB's launched in 1992, that partnership was ready to carry the new product directly into the living rooms of every child in America who was already watching the show every week. The candy and the cartoon were about to grow up together. What happened next would make BB's one of the most recognized candy products of the entire decade. The 1990s were good to Butterfinger BBs. Not good in the quiet, steady way of a product that simply held its shelf position year after year, but good in the loud, saturated, unavoidable way that only happens when a product lands in exactly the right cultural moment and refuses to leave. To understand what BBs meant at their peak, you have to remember what The Simpsons meant in 1992. This was not yet the show that had been on the air so long it had become furniture. This was the show that parents were complaining about, that school principals were banning Bart Simpson t-shirts over, that had put a cartoon family on the cover of Time magazine and made a 10-year-old troublemaker into the most recognizable face in American pop culture. Season 4 was about to air. The writing was at its sharpest. The ratings were pulling 25, sometimes 30 million viewers on a Sunday night. When Bart Simpson appeared in a commercial and said something, 30 million households heard it. And what Bart said over and over in television spots that ran throughout the early 1990s was that nobody better lay a finger on his Butterfinger. The line had originated with the bar, but when BBs arrived, the campaign absorbed them completely. Now Bart was protecting a bag of small round pieces, clutching them away from Homer, from Lisa, from anyone who got too close. The joke was the same every time, and it never got old because the joke wasn't really about the candy. It was about ownership, about a kid who had found something he loved and was not going to share it, which was, of course, exactly what made you want to grab a handful the moment no one was looking. The advertising worked because it was honest about what BBs actually were. They were not a refined candy. They were not meant to be savored slowly or eaten one at a time with any kind of restraint. They were meant to be poured, tipped from the bag into your palm or straight into your mouth if nobody was watching, passed around a circle of friends on the floor in front of the TV with the understanding that you had to move fast or the bag would come back empty. They rewarded speed and attention in a way that a candy bar never could, because a candy bar required you to unwrap it, to commit to it, to sit still for a moment. BBs required nothing except an open hand. What did they taste like exactly? The chocolate on the outside was thin, noticeably thinner than the coating on an M&M or a Reese's piece, and it gave way almost immediately, more of a signal than a flavor on its own. What it was signaling was the crunch underneath, that filling, the same layered flake peanut butter center that had been making Butterfinger bars distinctive since 1923, compressed now into a piece the size of a large marble, and it hit your back teeth with a texture that was genuinely unlike anything else in the bagged candy aisle. Not the smooth give of a peanut butter cup, Not the hard crack of a jawbreaker. Something in between. Structured, almost architectural. The kind of crunch that you felt in your jaw and heard in your head at the same time. And then the peanut butter flavor, rich and slightly salty, spreading out after the crunch faded. The whole experience lasted maybe 3 seconds, which was exactly why you immediately reached for another one. The movie theater was where BBs found one of their most natural homes. Nestle had invested in a theater-sized carton format, a long rectangular box, the kind you bought at the concession stand alongside the oversized sodas and the tubs of popcorn. The carton was designed to be tipped, and in the dark of a movie theater, in the middle of a film, that tipping motion became a private ritual. You angled the corner of the box toward your mouth, let a few pieces fall, and the sound, the faint rattle of the carton, the crack of the shells between your teeth, was swallowed by whatever was happening on screen. It was a candy designed for distraction, designed to be eaten without thinking, which meant you could finish an entire theater box before the opening credits were done and only realize it when you went back for more and found nothing left. Halloween brought a different version of the same ritual. Butterfinger had always been a Halloween candy. The orange and black color scheme on the wrapper was almost too perfect for October, as though the brand had been designed with the holiday in mind from the beginning. BBs arrived in fun-size boxes, small cardboard cartons printed in that same orange and black, light enough to rattle when you shook them, satisfying in the particular way that boxed candy is satisfying in a trick-or-treat haul. Not the soft thud of a chocolate bar dropping into the bag, but a small percussion. You knew exactly what was in there without opening it. And when you got home and spread your haul across the living room, carpet to sort and evaluate, the BB's boxes were in the keeper pile without discussion. The school lunch table had its own economy, and BB's had a specific position in it. They were shareable in a way that gave the person holding the bag a particular kind of social power. You could offer a handful and make a friend. You could withhold the bag and invoke Bart Simpson. Either way, the bag was the center of attention for as long as it lasted. Reese's Pieces operated in the same register, and the two candies competed for the same lunch table real estate throughout the decade. But BB's had the crunch, and the crunch was a differentiator that was hard to argue with when you were 11 years old and taste was the only standard that mattered. The parents who bought BB's were, in many cases, the same people who had grown up eating Butterfinger bars. The flavor was familiar to them in a way that created its own kind of loyalty. This wasn't a new candy asking them to try something unknown. It was an old candy arriving in a new form that made it easier to share with their kids. There were households in the 1990s where a bag of BB's appeared on the kitchen counter on Friday afternoon and was gone by Saturday morning, emptied out over 2 generations, sitting in front of the same television set, watching the same cartoon, eating the same candy that the commercial for that cartoon was selling them. The circularity of it was complete, and nobody found it strange, because in 1995, that was simply what Friday night looked like. What was it about those small round pieces that made them feel different from simply breaking a Butterfinger bar into chunks? And why did that difference matter so much to so many people for so long? The answer, if there is one, probably lives somewhere in the ritual rather than the recipe. The bar was a solo experience. BB's were a shared one. And in the decade when The Simpsons was the common language of American childhood, a candy that traveled in a bag and rewarded the fast and the bold felt exactly right. The peak lasted longer than most people remember. Through 1993, through 1995, through 1997, BB's held their shelf position, held their cultural presence, held their place in the candy aisle alongside the giants. But sometime in the late 1990s, something began to shift. Not loudly, not in any way that a shopper reaching for the orange bag on a Tuesday afternoon would have noticed, but in the places where these decisions get made, in the marketing budgets, in the retailer negotiations, in the internal portfolio reviews. The first quiet questions were starting to be asked about what exactly Butterfinger BBs were worth holding on to. Butterfinger BBs did not begin as a regional test. There was no quiet rollout in a handful of markets, no cautious year of watching sales data before committing to a national launch. When Nestlé brought BBs to market in 1992, they came out swinging. National distribution from day one, riding the full weight of the Nestlé sales infrastructure that was already moving Butterfinger bars, Baby Ruth, Crunch, and Kit Kat into every major grocery chain in the country. That was the advantage of launching inside a conglomerate with existing retailer relationships. You did not have to earn your shelf space the slow way. You walked in with it already negotiated. The chains that took BBs on were the same chains that defined American grocery shopping in the early 1990s. Kroger, Safeway, Winn-Dixie, A&P, Albertsons. These were the stores where the majority of American families did their weekly shopping. Stores with long candy aisles, with checkout line impulse displays, with seasonal end caps that could be loaded with orange and black Butterfinger packaging every October without anyone having to think twice about it. BBs fit naturally into every one of those placement opportunities. They came in a resealable sharing bag that belonged in the candy aisle. They came in a fun-size Halloween box that belonged on the seasonal end cap. They came in a theater-sized carton that belonged at the concession stand. Nestlé had built a product with multiple package formats from the start, and each format opened a different door into a different retail channel. The convenience store play was equally important. In the early 1990s, the American convenience store was still one of the primary candy purchasing environments for anyone under the age of 18. Gas stations with attached stores, 7-Elevens, regional chains like Wawa and Casey's and Circle K. These were the places where kids with $1 in their pocket made candy decisions without parental input. Butterfinger bar had always had a presence there. BBs slid into the same cooler-adjacent peg hooks and countertop displays. The sharing bag format perfectly sized for an impulse purchase that cost just over $1 at 1992 prices. You came in for a Slurpee and left with a bag of BBs. The transaction took 10 seconds and required no deliberation. But the most strategically significant channel was the movie theater. Nestlé had specifically developed the theater-sized carton format for BBs, and that decision reflected a clear understanding of what the product was for. Movie theater candy was a specific category with specific rules. It had to survive being held for 2 hours. It had to be quiet enough to eat in the dark without disturbing the people around you, or at least not so loud that you felt genuinely embarrassed. It had to be portioned in a way that lasted the length of a film, or at least gave the illusion that it might. The BB's carton, tipped carefully, met most of those requirements, and it placed Butterfinger in a retail environment where the primary competition was M&M's, Reese's Pieces, and Raisinets, products that had held the theater concession format for years. BB's arrival in that space was a direct challenge to the established order, and for a period in the mid-1990s, the orange carton was a common sight in the cup holders of movie theater seats across the country. The national rollout also benefited from timing that Nestlé had not entirely manufactured, but was wise enough to use. The Simpsons campaign launched alongside the product, and the combination of a nationally distributed candy and a nationally televised advertising campaign created a feedback loop that was difficult to build from scratch, but very easy to maintain once it was running. Kids saw the commercial on Sunday night. They went to school on Monday and talked about it. They went to the grocery store on Saturday with their parents and pointed at the bag. The loop closed in less than a week, and it closed reliably for the first several years of the product's life. What national distribution also meant, however, was that BBs were immediately subject to the full competitive pressure of the national candy market, a market that did not make room easily and did not hold space open out of sentiment. Shelf space in the candy aisle of a major grocery chain in 1992 was negotiated, paid for in slotting fees, and defended season by season. Every inch of that aisle was contested. M&M Mars was not going to reduce their presence to accommodate a new Nestlé product. Hershey was not going to pull Reese's Pieces off the shelf because BB's had arrived. What BB's gained in distribution, they had to maintain through sales velocity, through the simple metric of how many units moved off the shelf per week, per store, across tens of thousands of locations simultaneously. For the first several years, that number was sufficient. The Simpsons campaign kept the product visible. The Halloween season kept the fun-size boxes moving. The theater channel kept the carton format alive in a retail environment where Nestlé had few other products competing. BB's held their position, But inside the Nestlé portfolio, a pressure was building that had nothing to do with how good the candy tasted or how many people were buying it. Nestlé in the early 1990s was managing one of the most complex confectionery portfolios in the American market. Butterfinger, Baby Ruth, Crunch, Kit Kat, Raisinets, O. Henry, and a dozen smaller brands all competing for the same internal resources, the same marketing budget allocations, the same field sales attention. Every product in that portfolio needed to justify its continued existence, not just by selling, but by selling enough to warrant the space it was taking up. In the warehouse, on the production line, in the retailer relationship, and in the marketing calendar. BBs were selling, but they were selling as a supporting act in a very large show. And supporting acts, in a portfolio that size, are always the first to lose their rehearsal time when the headliner needs more of the stage. The peak was still ahead, but the conditions that would eventually end BBs were already written into the structure of the company that had created them. There is a specific window in American pop culture history when everything lined up for Butterfinger BBs. When the product, the advertising, the retail presence, and the cultural moment all arrived at the same place at the same time and held there long enough to leave a permanent mark on the memory of an entire generation. That window ran roughly from 1993 to 1997, and at the center of it, every single week, was a television show that was doing something no television show had ever quite done before. The Simpsons in its fourth, fifth, and sixth seasons was operating at a level of creative ambition that the medium of animation had never attempted. The writing staff was producing episodes that worked simultaneously as broad physical comedy, sharp social satire, and genuine emotional storytelling, sometimes within the same 4-minute act. The show was pulling between 20 and 30 million viewers on Sunday nights, numbers that placed it among the most watched programs on American television, regardless of format or genre. It was not a cartoon that adults tolerated because their children wanted to watch it. It was a cartoon that adults actively sought out, that they quoted at work on Monday morning, that they considered, correctly, to be among the best writing currently on American television. Bart Simpson, in those years, was not yet the reduced, simplified version of himself that later seasons would produce. He was a fully realized comic creation, a 10-year-old with a genuine internal life, capable of real mischief and real consequence, beloved by children because he said and did the things they were not allowed to say and do, and respected by adults because the show never let him be purely a punchline. He was the most famous fictional child in America, and he was officially and contractually the spokesperson for Butterfinger. The television commercials that ran throughout this period were built on a single premise that never required variation because it never stopped being funny. Bart had Butterfinger, the bar, the BBs, whatever form it arrived in, and someone else wanted it. Homer reached for the bag and got his hand slapped. Lisa attempted a reasonable argument for sharing and was ignored. Strangers, celebrities, characters from other shows. Everyone who approached Bart's Butterfinger supply received the same response, delivered in that flat suburban drawl that an entire generation could reproduce on command. Nobody better lay a finger on my Butterfinger. The line had existed before BB's. But something about the bite-sized format made it resonate differently. A candy bar you could hide in a wrapper, slip into a pocket, keep to yourself in a straightforward way. BB's came in a bag that rattled, a bag that announced its own presence, a bag that was inherently social because of its size and format. And yet the joke was that Bart would not share them under any circumstances. The comedy and the product reinforced each other in a way that felt genuinely organic rather than manufactured. You watched the commercial and understood immediately that these were a candy worth protecting. At the grocery store, BB's had achieved the kind of shelf presence that marketing teams spend years trying to engineer and mostly fail to sustain. The orange bag was bright enough to read from the end of the aisle. The Butterfinger branding was familiar enough that it required no explanation. The BB's sub-brand was distinctive enough that it had developed its own loyal consumer base separate from the bar. People who bought BB's specifically, not as a substitute for the bar, but as a different product with a different occasion and a different set of rituals attached to it. That kind of brand extension success, where the sub-product develops independent loyalty rather than simply borrowing from the parent, is rarer than it appears. Reese's Pieces had achieved it. Now BB's had achieved it. The households where BB's were a regular purchase had developed routines around them that had nothing to do with the advertising. A bag that appeared on the kitchen counter on Friday afternoon, a bowl set out during the Super Bowl, a box tucked into the trick-or-treat distribution pile every October without anyone having to make a conscious decision about it. It was simply what went in there, because it had always gone in there, because the orange and black color scheme made it feel like BB's had been designed specifically for that holiday, and that holiday had been designed specifically for BB's. Parents who had grown up eating Butterfinger bars were now buying BB's for their children. This was the generational transmission that product marketers dream about and rarely achieve cleanly. Not just brand loyalty passing from one generation to the next, but a product format that worked for both generations simultaneously. The parent recognized the flavor from childhood. The child had no memory of the bar and experienced BB's as their own discovery. The same orange bag meant something different to each of them and something shared to both of them. That overlap, in a family sitting on the same couch watching the same show on a Sunday night, was the purest expression of what the product had become by the middle of the decade. When a candy bar and a cartoon character grow up together in the same decade, what happens to the candy when the cartoon moves on? In 1990, the advertising partnership between Nestlé and The Simpsons came to an end. The contract expired, the renewal did not happen, and Bart Simpson stopped appearing in Butterfinger commercials. For the bar, this was manageable. The bar had 60 years of brand recognition behind it and did not require Bart to explain what it was or why someone should buy it. For BB's, the situation was categorically different. BB's had been introduced to the American public alongside Bart. Their peak years of cultural visibility had been his peak years of cultural dominance. The two had grown up together in exactly the way the question implied. And now the cartoon was moving on, entering its middle seasons, losing some of the cultural urgency that had made it unmissable in the early 1990s. The candy had no equivalent transition plan. There was no new campaign waiting to replace the old one. There was no new identity being constructed to carry BB's forward into the next decade. There was just the shelf, and the shelf, it turned out, had a long memory for which products were still being supported and which ones had simply stopped showing up. The shopper who reached for a bag of Butterfinger BB's in 1999 had no reason to think anything was wrong. The bag was still there. The price was still reasonable. The candy inside still tasted exactly the way it always had. Nothing on the outside of that transaction announced that the product was in trouble, because from the outside, it wasn't. BB's were still selling. They were still on the shelf. They were still moving through checkout lines in grocery stores across the country, still appearing in Halloween distribution, still sitting in the theater concession stand carton format that had been part of their identity since launch. But in the places where the future of a product actually gets decided, in the marketing budget meetings, in the retailer negotiation rooms, in the internal portfolio reviews where brand managers present their numbers to people whose job is to allocate limited resources across unlimited competing demands, the picture looked different. And the cracks that were forming in those rooms in the late 1990s would take several years to reach the surface, which made them more dangerous, not less. The first and most significant crack had nothing to do with the candy itself. It had to do with silence. When the Nestlé and Simpsons advertising partnership ended in the late 1990s, Butterfinger BB's lost the single most powerful marketing engine they had ever had. For 5 years, Bart Simpson had been appearing on television screens in front of 30 million households every week, holding a bag of BB's and making the case, loudly, repeatedly, memorably, that this was a candy worth having. That campaign had not just sold product, it had built identity. It had told consumers, and more importantly, told the retail buyers who decided what went on grocery store shelves, that BB's were a brand with cultural weight behind them, a brand that was being invested in, a brand that someone at the parent company believed in, enough to spend serious money promoting. When the campaign ended, the silence that replaced it was noticed. Not by individual shoppers who rarely track the advertising calendars of their favorite products, but by the grocery buyers at Kroger and Safeway and Winn-Dixie who had been giving BBs their shelf position, partly on the strength of that Simpsons association. A product with a Bart Simpson commercial was a product with momentum. A product without one was just another bag in the candy aisle, competing on velocity numbers alone. In Nestlé, for reasons that were never publicly articulated in any detail, did not replace the Simpsons campaign with anything of equivalent scale. There were no new television spots built around a new spokesperson or a new concept. There was no reinvention of the BB's identity to carry it into the 2000s as its own thing, independent of the show that had launched it. The marketing support that had been sustaining the product's cultural visibility simply contracted, not all at once, not in a way that generated a press release or a memo anyone outside the company would have seen, but steadily and measurably in the only way that ultimately matters for a consumer product. Less advertising meant less awareness, and less awareness meant slower sales, and slower sales meant less justification for the shelf space, and less shelf space meant even slower sales. The second crack was structural, and it had been present since the day BB's launched, waiting for the conditions that would make it visible. Inside Nestlé's American confectionery portfolio, in the late 1990s, BB's occupied an awkward position. They were a line extension of Butterfinger, not an independent brand. Their identity was entirely dependent on the parent brand's identity, which meant that in any internal resource allocation decision, the parent brand came first. When Nestlé had to choose between spending money to support Butterfinger Bar and spending money to support Butterfinger BBs, the bar won. It always won. The bar had been on the market since 1923. The bar had name recognition that predated the current ownership by 7 decades. The bar required no explanation and no campaign to maintain its basic shelf presence. BBs, by contrast, needed active support to exist, needed advertising to remind consumers they were there, needed promotional activity to justify the shelf space to retailers, needed someone in the building to keep making the case for them season after season. How long can a company allow a product to live on the momentum of a marketing campaign that has already ended? Before the shelf catches up to the silence? By the early 2000s, the shelf was catching up. Retail buyers, working through their periodic category reviews, were looking at BB's velocity numbers, units sold per store per week, and comparing them against the competition that was actively fighting for the same space. M&M's had launched Crispy M&M's in 1999, adding a crunch element that directly encroached on one of BB's primary points of difference. Reese's Pieces continued to hold their position with a kind of deep institutional loyalty that a 30-year shelf history produces. The bagged bite-sized candy segment was not shrinking, it was getting more crowded. And the products gaining ground in that segment were the ones with active marketing support, new flavor extensions, and promotional tie-ins that kept them visible to both consumers and retail buyers. BB's had none of those things in the early 2000s. They had a flavor that loyal consumers still loved, a brand name that still carried recognition, and a shelf position that was getting harder to defend with each passing category review. Store managers at individual locations were beginning to make quiet decisions, not restocking as frequently, allocating the facing space to products with stronger sell-through numbers, treating BB's as a secondary item rather than a guaranteed shelf fixture. The loyal shopper in 2002 still found the bag when they looked for it, but they were starting to have to look harder. And in the grocery store, a product that requires effort to find is already most of the way to gone. There is a particular kind of corporate decision that looks from the inside like responsible portfolio management and looks from the outside like abandonment. The people who make these decisions are not villains. They are working from spreadsheets, from velocity reports, from quarterly targets that have to be met, and annual plans that have to be defended in front of people whose patience for underperforming SKUs is limited and whose job it is to ask hard questions about why resources are being spent on products that are not pulling their weight. The logic is consistent and the math usually checks out. What the spreadsheets do not capture, what they are not designed to capture, is what it means to the person standing in the candy aisle when the thing they have been reaching for since 1992 is no longer there. By the early 2000s, Butterfinger BBs had entered the phase of their corporate life that precedes discontinuation, without anyone necessarily deciding that discontinuation is the goal. It is a slower process than that, and in some ways more damaging. A gradual withdrawal of the conditions that allow a product to survive, one budget cycle at a time, until survival becomes impossible and the outcome that was never officially chosen becomes the only outcome available. The first and most consequential decision was the one that had already been made by omission in the late 1990s, the decision not to rebuild the BB's marketing identity after the Simpsons partnership ended. This was not recorded anywhere as a formal choice to let the product decline. It was recorded, if it was recorded at all, as a resource allocation decision, a judgment that the available marketing budget was better deployed against the Butterfinger bar, which had stronger velocity numbers and a longer track record than against BB's, which needed significant investment to maintain visibility and was not generating returns that justified that investment at the level required. The circular logic of that decision was invisible to the people making it, but would have been immediately apparent to anyone watching from outside. BB's needed marketing support to maintain sales velocity. Without sales velocity, they could not justify marketing support. The conclusion: reduce the support, watch the velocity fall, use the falling velocity to justify further support reduction, was not a strategy. It was a mechanism. And once it engaged, it was very difficult to reverse because each step in the sequence produced data that validated the next step. Nestlé's internal portfolio review process, standard across major FMCG companies in the early 2000s, was not designed to ask whether a product deserved to survive on sentimental grounds. It was designed to ask whether a product was earning its place in the portfolio, whether it was generating sufficient margin, sufficient volume, sufficient retailer enthusiasm to justify the production costs, the warehouse space, the sales team attention, and the supply chain complexity that came with keeping it alive. BBs by the early 2000s were struggling to answer those questions satisfactorily. Not because the candy was bad, not because consumers had stopped wanting it, but because the conditions that had allowed it to answer those questions in the 1990s, the Simpsons campaign, the peak distribution, the cultural visibility, had been withdrawn, one element at a time, until the product was being measured against the standards it no longer had the support to meet. The production reality made the decision easier to rationalize. Butterfinger BBs required a manufacturing process that was distinct from the bar: the miniaturized layered filling, the spherical forming, the thin chocolate shell application, and that process occupied production capacity that could theoretically be redirected toward products with stronger portfolio justification. In a manufacturing environment where every line hour has a cost and every cost has to be defended, a product with declining velocity and no active marketing support is a difficult argument to make to the people who allocate production resources. The bar could be made faster, cheaper, and in greater volume. The bar had a guaranteed shelf position. The bar was not a question anyone was asking. The people who felt these decisions most directly were not the executives who made them. They were the workers on the production lines where BBs were manufactured. Employees whose shifts and job security were tied to the continued operation of equipment that was, quietly, being scheduled less frequently and maintained with less urgency as the years passed. There is no public record of how many people worked specifically on the BB's production process or what happened to them when that process was wound down. Corporate discontinuations do not generate the kind of documentation that preserves those details. What is preserved is the product brief and the discontinuation date. The people behind the product brief are a different kind of record, kept in a different kind of place. And who exactly was supposed to tell the people who loved this product that it was leaving before it was already gone? The retailers were getting the message before the consumers were. Grocery buyers at major chains working through their 2004 and 2005 category reviews were seeing BB's slot into the lower tier of their candy aisle performance rankings. Not at the bottom, not a product that was obviously failing, but not a product that any retailer felt urgency to protect or promote. The promotional support that had historically accompanied the product's Halloween season push had thinned. The display materials that had once made BBs visible at the end of caps and in checkout line impulse positions were no longer arriving with the same regularity. Retailers respond to these signals the way water responds to gravity. They flow toward the products that are being actively supported and away from the ones that are not. Shelf facings were quietly reduced. Reorder quantities were adjusted downward. The product remained technically available, but it was occupying less and less physical and psychological space in the stores that carried it. Consumers noticed in the way that loyal consumers always notice before they understand what they are noticing. The bag was harder to find at one store, so you checked another. The theater carton was no longer in the concession display, so you assumed it was temporarily out of stock. The Halloween boxes were in the seasonal aisle one October, and the following October you looked and they were not there, and you made a mental note to check again next year. The discontinuation of a beloved product rarely announces itself cleanly. It arrives through a series of small absences that each have a plausible, innocent explanation, until one day the pattern of small absences becomes undeniable, and the explanation is no longer innocent. Somewhere in 2005 or 2006, the exact date was never publicly confirmed with the precision that loyal consumers deserved. The last production run of Butterfinger BBs came off the line. No press release, no farewell packaging, no acknowledgement that something was ending. Just the last bag sealed and shipped, making its way through the distribution chain toward a shelf where it would eventually sell through and not be replaced. The shelf had been given its instructions. It just hadn't told anyone yet. The first sign was not a headline. It was not an announcement on the Nestlé website or a notice from the grocery store or a segment on the evening news. It was a hand reaching for a familiar spot on a familiar shelf and finding nothing there. That was how most people found out. Not from the company, from the shelf itself. For some shoppers, the realization came in the candy aisle of their regular grocery store sometime in 2006. For others, it had been coming for months. The occasional stock out that resolved itself. The missing theater carton at the concession stand that you assumed was a supply issue. The Halloween boxes that seemed harder to find that October than they had been the year before. The disappearance of Butterfinger BBs did not happen on a single day. It happened the way most things that matter happen. Gradually, then all at once. With no clear line between the gradual part and the all-at-once part that you could point to afterward and say, that was the moment. What made it particularly disorienting for loyal consumers was the absence of any explanation from the brand. Nestlé did not issue a discontinuation statement when BBs left the market. There was no press release, no farewell campaign, no limited edition final run with commemorative packaging that at least acknowledged the product's history and said goodbye with some dignity. The silence was total. A product that had been in American grocery stores for 14 years, that had been marketed on national television for 5 of those years, alongside the most recognizable cartoon character in American pop culture, that had accumulated a genuinely loyal consumer base across 2 generations. That product simply stopped being available, and the company that made it offered no public accounting of why. The consumers who noticed first were the ones who bought BBs regularly enough to track their absence across multiple shopping trips. They checked a second store, then a third. They asked the stock clerk, who checked the system and said it wasn't showing as on order. They drove to a different grocery chain and found the same empty slot where the orange bag had always been. And then, because this was the mid-2000s and the internet had become the place where people went to confirm that they were not imagining things, they went online. What they found there was each other. The early online communities where BB's grief collected were not the polished nostalgia platforms that exist today. They were message boards, forum threads, the comment sections of food blogs that had mentioned the product in passing, people typing variations of the same question. Does anyone know if Butterfinger BBs are discontinued? And finding, in the responses, a recognition that was almost more painful than the loss itself. Because what the responses confirmed was not just that the product was gone. They confirmed that dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of people had been conducting the same quiet search, checking the same empty shelves, asking the same unanswered questions, and arriving at the same conclusion with no official confirmation to anchor it. Nestlé, when they eventually addressed the discontinuation, and it took time before any statement appeared in any public forum, offered a characteristically brief and unsatisfying explanation. Insufficient sales. The product had not generated the volume required to sustain continued production. It was a statement that was technically accurate and emotionally tone-deaf in equal measure, because it framed the loss entirely in the language of commercial performance, while saying nothing about the 14 years of consumer loyalty that the performance metrics had apparently failed to capture. Insufficient sales, as though the tens of thousands of people who had been buying BBs regularly were simply not enough people, as though loyalty, if it does not scale to the size required by a multinational portfolio review, does not count. The eBay listings appeared almost immediately. New old stock, sealed bags and cartons of BBs that had survived in gas station back rooms and convenience store stockrooms and the forgotten corners of grocery warehouse shelves, surfaced online within months of the product's confirmed disappearance. And the prices they commanded told you everything you needed to know about the distance between Nestlé's assessment of BB's commercial value and the assessment held by the people who had actually loved them. Bags that had retailed for $1.50 were selling for $8, $10, $15. A sealed theater carton was a collector's item. The market for a discontinued candy had materialized overnight, as it always does when something beloved disappears without warning, and the prices in that market were a direct rebuttal to the insufficient sales rationale. A reminder that demand and distribution are not the same thing, and that a product can be genuinely wanted by a genuine community of consumers while simultaneously failing to meet the volume thresholds of a global confectionery conglomerate. The Facebook groups came later as the platform grew into the primary gathering place for exactly the demographic that had grown up eating BBs in the 1990s. Groups with names like Bring Back Butterfinger BBs accumulated tens of thousands of members with a speed that surprised even the people who created them. The posts in those groups followed a consistent pattern. A member sharing a memory, a photograph of an old bag, a story about finding a single surviving box at a rural gas station and eating it in the parking lot because they didn't trust themselves to wait until they got home. The comments on those posts ran into the hundreds. People who had not thought about BBs in years, reading someone else's description of the candy, suddenly remembering exactly what it tasted like, exactly where they had eaten it, exactly who they had been with. The candy shop owners and the specialty retailers who catered to nostalgia consumers felt the demand directly. Customers who came in asking for BBs, sometimes not even remembering the exact name, just describing the small, round Butterfinger pieces in the orange bag, were a consistent presence in those stores for years after the discontinuation. The owners could not help them. There was nothing to sell. The product was gone, and no equivalent existed that could honestly be offered as a substitute. What had filled the shelf space that BBs vacated? The answer was both predictable and quietly insulting to anyone who had loved the product. The space went to whatever the grocery buyer's planogram assigned it to, which meant more facings for M&M's extensions, more space for Reese's products, more room for the private label options that had been quietly gaining ground throughout the early 2000s. The candy aisle did not mourn the absence of BBs. It simply closed the gap, the way water closes over a stone that has been dropped into it, and within a season there was no physical evidence on the shelf that the orange bag had ever been there. The factory workers who had run the production lines, the regional sales representatives who had carried the product into retailer meetings, the grocery buyers who had given BBs their shelf position, based partly on a relationship and partly on a belief that the product was worth supporting. These were the people who experienced the end of BBs not as a consumer loss, but as a professional one. Their stories were not recorded anywhere. They did not appear in the food industry trade press or in the corporate communications that marked the product's passing. They simply absorbed the change, the way people in manufacturing and distribution always absorbed these changes, and moved on to whatever came next. The last bag of Butterfinger BBs was purchased by someone who did not know it was the last bag. That is almost always how it goes. There is no ceremony for the final transaction, no acknowledgement that what is changing hands is not just a candy, but the end of something. The register printed a receipt. The bag went into a pocket or a purse or the backseat of a car. The candy was eaten, probably quickly, probably without full appreciation of what it was. The way you eat a thing when you believe there will always be more of it. There would not be more of it. The shelf was empty, and this time nobody was coming to fill it. 3 years after Butterfinger BBs disappeared from American shelves, Nestle introduced a product called Butterfinger Bites. The name was close enough that longtime BB's consumers noticed immediately, and the concept was familiar enough that the same consumers allowed themselves briefly to hope. Small pieces, chocolate coating, that peanut butter crunch center. On paper, Butterfinger Bites was everything BB's had been. It was not everything BB's had been. The difference was not subtle to the people who had spent years looking for a replacement. The shape was wrong, not spherical but irregular, closer to a miniature version of the bar than to the round, self-contained pieces that had defined the BB's experience. The chocolate shell sat differently. The ratio of coating to filling felt different. The way the piece broke when you bit into it was different. These are the kinds of distinctions that sound precious when described in words and feel completely obvious when experienced in the mouth, and the consumers who had been waiting 3 years for something to replace BB's experienced them as a verdict rather than a quibble. Bites were not bad. They were simply not the thing that had been taken away. And the absence of the thing that had been taken away was not a problem that a slightly different version of that thing could solve. The online communities that had formed around the memory of BB's received Butterfinger Bites with a mixture of cautious welcome and immediate disappointment that played out across forum threads and Facebook group posts with the specific emotional texture of someone trying to be fair about a thing they already know they don't like. People gave Bites a genuine chance. They bought multiple bags. They compared notes. They agreed almost universally that Bites were a reasonable product that bore no meaningful relationship to what had been lost. The petitions calling for the return of the original BBs continued after Bites launched, which was the clearest possible signal that the successor product had not addressed the actual demand. Nestlé's ownership of the Butterfinger brand continued until 2018, and in those 12 years between the launch of Bites and the brand's next change of hands, there was no serious public movement within the company toward reviving BBs in their original form. The Bites product represented Nestlé's answer to the question of what to do with the demonstrated consumer demand for bite-sized Butterfinger pieces, and having provided that answer, the company considered the matter resolved. That the answer was considered inadequate by the consumers who had asked the question was information that existed primarily in online communities and occasional customer service emails, places where corporate portfolio strategy rarely goes to update its assumptions. In 2018, Ferrero, the Italian confectionery company, best known in the American market for Nutella and Ferrero Rocher, acquired Nestlé's entire American candy portfolio in a deal valued at approximately $2.8 billion. The transaction transferred ownership of Butterfinger, Baby Ruth, Crunch, 100 Grand, and several other brands to a new parent company that had its own priorities, its own portfolio logic, and its own set of decisions to make about what to invest in and what to leave alone. Ferrero's primary intervention with the Butterfinger brand was a significant reformulation of the bar itself, completed in 2019. A genuine improvement to the chocolate quality and the filling texture that was well received by food media and by consumers who had grown up on the original. The bar got better. BB's remained absent. The change of ownership represented the clearest opportunity in the brand's history to revisit the BB's question with fresh eyes. A new parent company, unburdened by the specific internal politics and budget decisions that had led to the original discontinuation, looking at the Butterfinger franchise and deciding what it should be. Ferrero did not take that opportunity. Whether the decision was based on production complexity, portfolio priorities, or simply a lack of awareness of how persistently and specifically the demand for BBs had been maintained by consumers across nearly 15 years, the outcome was the same. The orange bag did not return. What does it say about how we value things? That a candy with tens of thousands of people actively petitioning for its return still sits unrevived, while the corporation that owns the name has simply moved on to other priorities? The broader industry lesson written into the BB story is one that the food industry has absorbed imperfectly and applied inconsistently. The lesson is this: a product built around a single marketing partnership is a product with a structural vulnerability that no amount of consumer loyalty can fully compensate for. When the Simpsons campaign ended, BBs had no independent identity to fall back on, no mascot of their own, no slogan that belonged specifically to them rather than to the parent bar, no cultural association that survived the end of the contract. They were Bart's candy. When Bart moved on, they had to become something else, and no one at Nestlé built the something else in time. The contrast with products that survive similar pressures is instructive. Reese's Pieces had been E.T.'s candy since 1982, and when the film's cultural moment faded, the product had been on shelves long enough and had generated sufficient independent loyalty that it survived the transition without visible damage. M&M's had weathered dozens of cultural shifts across 50 years by continuously reinventing their marketing identity while keeping the product itself consistent. BB's had neither the longevity nor the reinvention. They had Bart, and then they had silence, and the silence was fatal. The communities of consumers who still remember BB's today, who still post about them in nostalgia groups, who still occasionally email Ferrero to ask about revival, who still describe the candy to people who never tasted it with a specificity and an emotion that does not diminish with time. These communities represent something that the commercial logic of portfolio management is poorly equipped to measure. They represent a product that did its job completely. That created a taste memory strong enough to survive 15 years of absence. That built a ritual, the bag, the pour, the crunch, the Bart Simpson commercial playing in the background, that lodged itself permanently in the experience of a generation. A product that does that is not a product that failed. It is a product that was failed. The shelf moved on. The memory did not. There was an orange bag. It was bright enough to find from the end of the aisle without looking for it. The kind of color that registers before you have consciously decided to pay attention. You picked it up and it had weight to it, a satisfying density. And when you shook it, you could hear the pieces shifting against each other inside, a dry, rattling sound that was its own form of promise. You tore it open along the top, and the smell hit you before the first piece reached your hand. Chocolate, peanut butter, warm and slightly sweet, the specific combination that the Butterfinger name had been delivering since 1923, but concentrated now into something smaller, more immediate, more available than a bar wrapped in a wrapper that you had to commit to unwrapping. You poured a handful. The pieces were round and smooth in your palm, the chocolate shell catching the light with a faint sheen. You put one in your mouth, and for a fraction of a second there was just the chocolate, thin, present, doing its job. And then the shell gave way and the crunch arrived. Not the crunch of a chip, not the crunch of a cookie, the specific crunch of Butterfinger's layered peanut butter filling, compressed into a piece the size of a marble, structured and architectural and gone in 3 seconds, leaving behind a richness that spread slowly and stayed longer than the piece itself had lasted. You reached for another one before the first one had fully faded. That was the design. That was always the design. Bart Simpson was saying something on the television in the background. It didn't matter what. Nothing about that moment required your full attention except the bag in your hand and the television in front of you and the particular safety of being exactly where you were, with nothing required of you yet. Those 3 seconds of crunch were not a small thing. They were, for a specific generation of Americans, one of the most precisely remembered sensory experiences of an entire decade. The people who ate Butterfinger BBs between 1992 and 2006 do not remember them vaguely. They remember them exactly. The weight of the bag, the rattle of the pieces, the thinness of the chocolate shell, the way the filling broke, the way the peanut butter flavor arrived after the crunch subsided. They remember where they were eating them. They remember who was with them. They remember what was on television. Sensory memory of that specificity does not accumulate around things that did not matter. It accumulates around things that were woven into the fabric of daily life at a moment when daily life was being formed, when the routines and rituals and flavors of childhood were laying down the templates that everything experienced afterward would be measured against. BBs were woven into that fabric for a generation that grew up watching a cartoon family navigate the same anxieties and comedies and small disasters that their own families were navigating, and who ate a specific candy during that cartoon because a fictional 10-year-old told them it was worth protecting. That is not a trivial cultural connection. That is the kind of connection that turns a food product into a memory, and a memory into something that people carry forward into adulthood and describe to their children with more emotion than the subject seems, on the surface, to warrant. The subject warrants exactly that emotion. The emotion is the point. What BB's provided that no replacement has honestly offered was not a flavor. Butterfinger bites are close enough in flavor that the difference, described on paper, sounds minor. What BB's provided was a form, a specific shape, a specific size, a specific ratio of shell to filling, that created a specific experience of eating, and that experience was inseparable from the decade and the show and the living room floor and the Halloween bag and the movie theater darkness in which it was first encountered. You cannot reverse engineer a ritual by reproducing the ingredients. You can only reproduce the ingredients and hope that someone who was never part of the original ritual finds something worth starting a new one around. That is what Butterfinger Bites asked consumers to do. And the consumers who remembered BBs were not in a position to do it because the original ritual was already complete and already gone, and the ingredients alone were not enough. The factory workers who ran the production lines that made BBs, the sales representatives who carried the product into grocery buyer meetings, the truck drivers who moved the pallets through the distribution chain, the stock clerks who loaded the orange bags onto the shelf. These people built something that outlasted the production line, outlasted the contract, outlasted the corporate ownership. They built a taste that a generation still reaches for when it reaches into memory. That work deserves to be named as what it was, the construction of something real and specific and irreplaceable, made by people whose names were never on the packaging and whose contribution to the culture of American candy was never formally acknowledged and does not require formal acknowledgement to be true. Somewhere tonight, someone is describing the taste of BBs to a person who never had them. They are searching for the right words, trying to explain the crunch, the thinness of the shell, the way the peanut butter flavor arrived after the piece was already gone, and finding that the words are inadequate, the way words are always inadequate for sensory memory, the way you can describe a taste perfectly and still not transfer the experience of it to someone who was not there. The person listening understands from the way it is being described that something specific and unrepeatable was here, that it mattered to the person describing it in a way that goes beyond preference or habit, that its absence is a real absence, not a sentimental one. The bag is gone. The shelf has moved on. The cartoon that introduced them to 30 million households is still on the air, older now, its earliest seasons more than 30 years behind it. But the crunch is still there, in the memory of everyone who heard it, exact and specific and completely intact, waiting with the particular patience of things that were genuinely loved for someone to decide it was worth bringing back. Nobody has decided that yet.